Hi, everybody. It's Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ. Welcome to today's Connect webinar with Tenzig. I'm happy to welcome you back to the webinar stage today. Before we jump in, just a quick reminder that we have lots of CUGC events coming up. If you're new to CUGC, definitely go to our website. You can see the link down at the bottom of your screen to our events calendar. There's lots of stuff going on, and you just want to find your local group, find your city. We've got them all over the world. See what's going on and get registered. We've got some virtual events obviously coming up. Next week we have a user share that is someone from the community who's coming up wanting to share their own knowledge, and this is Owen Reynolds. He's a Citrix technology advocate, so he's got some best practices for sustainable Citrix implementations, and he also has a companion blog post that goes with it, so check that out. And then coming up in June is our XL. The next one is the Northeast region, so we've got lots of great speakers lined up for that, so check that one out as well. Alrighty, just a couple of housekeeping details for everyone. We are recording today's session. You'll get a link to the recording tomorrow. It's going to come to you in an email directly from GoToWebinar, so be on the lookout for that. Also, you can submit your questions in the question chat box anytime. Be sure to do it when you have them so that you don't forget them, and we'll try to take as many as we can today. And finally, at the end of the session, I'll throw a link in the chat to a survey. It's short and anonymous and for CUGC use only. We just like to get your feedback on our webinars. Helps us plan for future events. All right, so I'm going to introduce our webinar companions. We have Kevin Greenway. He is the CTO of Tenzig. Hi, Kevin. I think he's coming to us. Thank you. Sorry, a little audio delay. Also, we have Carl Webster. He's going to be our moderator today. He's going to be keeping an eye on all those questions that you put in the chat for us. So yes, he was watching.
Keeping me honest.
All right, so I'm going to hand things right on over to you, Kevin. I'm going to send you the screen right now. Here it comes. It's mouse over there. Okay. And I'm going to turn off my camera, and I'll see you guys in a little while.
That's great. Thanks, Stephanie. Let me just make sure I am sharing the right screen. Yes, I am. Hopefully everybody can see the first slide. So yeah, I'm Kevin Greenway. Let me just get this out of view. And thank you for having me here at today's CUGC. I'm really excited to be presenting. And just a quick background of myself first. So I've been with Tenzig for 9 years and experienced in Citrix amongst other EUC and VDI products. I head up the R&D and support teams globally at Tenzig and work closely with all of our departments pretty much, and also manage the relationship with Citrix Ready and other partners as part of our ecosystem. So I'm here today to present the latest from Tenzig and Citrix around our unified communications offerings, and that includes Microsoft Teams optimization improvements, as well as Cisco Webex VDI support. And this will include a demonstration on the recently introduced Cisco Webex VDI support. So we'll kick off in a second, but I think just to start, we've got poll question number 1, if you wouldn't mind, please, Stephanie. So it's, are you using Tenzig Thin or Zero clients already? So if you wouldn't mind answering the question, just so I can gauge our audience today, please. All right, that's good. So yeah, good mixture there, and it looks like we've got some new friends to the table. So thanks again for joining. So I'll continue on. So a quick background, firstly, on Tenzig for those who are not aware. We're solely focused as a thin and zero client vendor, and we're specialized in Citrix amongst other VDI and EUC products. We're headquartered in Phoenix, Arizona, with our EMEA office in the UK, which is, as you can probably tell from my accent, where I'm based. And we're a founding Citrix Ready partner, which basically means that we certify all of our products on the Citrix Ready marketplace. And where we're able to differ from competitors is that we're solely focused, and our staff through sales and technical support are skilled in Citrix through training and certification, which really take our pre-sales and post-sales and support to the next level. We're a front runner in many Citrix innovations, which included the recently introduced Citrix Ready Workspace Endpoint program, as well as being certified on our thin clients for Skype for Business, and more recently Microsoft Teams and Zoom VDI. And our company motto, which is more relevant than ever, is that we make our product fit your environment and not the other way around. And as mentioned, that's really more critical than ever with the fact that we're dealing with really fast paced and changing times, and obviously dealing with end user computing, which is essentially now remote working. So very quickly, just to discuss our Citrix Ready endpoints, and then we'll kick off. So we have a range of 0 clients plus thin clients based on Linux and Windows. All our endpoints are Intel and AMD based, and as you can see, include a wide array of hardware options such as varying display connectivity, USB-C, fiber, and PoE. All of our Tenzig endpoints include enterprise-free centralized management via the Tenzig Manager, and we also offer cloud enablement for remote management. We have a range of Teams optimized Citrix Ready endpoints, and we also offer a flexible demo program for anybody wanting to trial our products in your Citrix environment or POCs. So this slide then brings us to the hot topic of today and the trend for Tenzig over the past year, or to be precise now, 14 months. And that's really the exponential demand for unified communication apps. And this particular usage scenario is literally upturn the books of end user computing, and in particular using such applications in a desktop or application remoting scenario. So let's take a moment just to assess the growth here and put things into a little bit of perspective. So firstly, Microsoft Teams quickly surged to 44 million active users way back in March 2020 at the start of the pandemic. And we did another quick search before the webinar, and as you can see, astonishingly, that's risen to 115 million today. And secondly, an engineering firm saw a 129% increase in AV minutes and 143% increase in participants on their UC platform. And then finally, specifically in China, way back in February 2020, Cisco saw 22 times the amount of network traffic just in China alone that was consolidated for Cisco Webex traffic. And then if we sort of turn that trend towards today, where again, majority of employees are communicating through UC and collaboration tools. So the future, or the position that we're at the moment, is somewhat sketchy in terms of whether businesses and employees are going to, I guess, work in a permanent work from home situation, a return to the office, or a hybrid of both in what's referred to as the flexible option. But what we see on the slide here, and specifically not calling out the UC platform, but it seems to be a general trend, is the fact that we can see the revenue growth from Q4 2019, as well as revenue projections right through to Q4 2021. And again, just to bring up some further interesting stats here, Gartner make the assumption that by 2022, 74% of organizations will move at least 5% of their workforce from temporary work from home to permanent remote working. But I think certainly what we're sort of hearing and seeing in talking to people and reading the media is that 82% of company leaders plan to allow their employees to work remotely some of the time as we head out of the pandemic. And this again adds to that whole discussion around the flexible working approach, which really gives the best of both worlds of remote working plus office to get that physical collaboration back. And then finally, Million Insights then predicts that the UC market will reach 167 billion by 2025. And that shows a compound annual growth rate of 16.8% between the years stated. So this really sets the path for the future. And as we'll move on now, how Tenzig are embracing this future. And we just have poll question 2 again, please, Stephanie. So again, really appreciate everybody's response here. All right, so there we go. So it does definitely look as if the consensus is on flexible and hybrid working. So thanks again for taking the time to answer that. So the purpose of this next slide is to briefly discuss a potential problem of using unified communication and collaboration platforms in a virtual environment such as Citrix. And this problem has been exacerbated further in a remote working environment, as I'll explain. So the user's endpoints, again, let's assume now that they're both at home locations where they're dealing with video and voice, have to forward video and voice between the end user's home locations towards the data center, whether it's on premise or whether it's in the cloud. And that audio video stream is then converted at the virtual desktop and then forwarded either to the other peer, if it's a peer-to-peer call or peer-to-peer solution, or it traverses through the UC solution, which again could be in the cloud as is demonstrated here, or on premise. And whilst Citrix has some long-standing Hdx compression techniques to improve these scenarios, so for example, it can compress quite significantly the webcam and audio between these two points, as you can see, it generates this well-known and famous kind of hairpin or trombone effect, where the voice is really having to travel around the whole circuit. And that ultimately adds latency and delay, but also more importantly, adds the compute demand onto the virtual desktops. All of that webcam encoding is and the voice encoding is done on the virtual desktop and leaves really the endpoints pretty much to an idle situation. So this solution these days is pretty much considered a fallback and is generally not recommended, as we'll explain. So the preferred approach, and specifically the big change over last year, I mean, this solution's been around for a few years now, but a lot of the UC vendors have adopted this same approach, is to encode that same audio and video locally at the endpoint using something like a thin client that's equipped with a media engine alongside the Citrix Workspace app, and then allows really the users that if they're in a voice call, that the voice and the video, i.e. the SRTP, traverses between the two users directly. So the point here is it never traverses through the VDA. So all of that compute power is relinquished and freed up. So again, if you cloud-based specifically, that's going to really offer up a lot of savings. And if it's a UC solution that's cloud-based, again, the voice and the video is going directly to that UC solution and not towards the data center that's specifically hosting the VDI. So you're eliminating effectively redundant paths with this as well, and improving the user experience to the same degree you would expect from a regular desktop or laptop. So this is a really important slide that kind of breaks it down even further, and it focuses on the framework and SDK that's available from Citrix, which is the platform optimization and virtual channel SDK. And this is provided to unified communication and collaboration partners. So the unified communication application is installed to the virtual desktop or published app as it is as per normal. But the change is that it's essentially VDI aware. So it's either a separate installation that's VDI specific, or it's installed in a specific scenario, such as with a switch when you install the app to make it VDI aware. That then synchronizes with the Citrix VDA and the Hdx components. And what effectively happens is the authentication and the signaling remains at the unified communications app, because they're the kind of low latency and low power as far as compute power processes. And then the media engine, specifically the parts that do the grunt work, the encoding of the video and the voice, they effectively get offloaded to the endpoint. So the endpoint hosts the Citrix Workspace app as well as the media engine, and then it deals with the voice and the video traffic directly. And then it's synchronized through the Hdx transport layer using the media and the call control virtual channel. So it's essentially encapsulated exactly the same way that the incoming display and graphics and audio are to the endpoint and encapsulated into one. So with that, it's just a good opportunity to summarize Tenzig's activity in this area, really since the early pandemic and work from home situation. So firstly, we offered improved audio support for hot plugging of things like USB headsets. We also offered up very quickly the very latest LTSR version of the Hdx real-time optimization pack, and that actually offered some improvements to audio scenarios specifically for remote working. Also, significantly Microsoft Teams optimization. So Tenzig were amongst the first here to integrate for both our Windows and Linux-based clients, and we were able to offer customers who were literally chomping at the bit back in April last year to get access to the EAR versions for Linux. And then in very quick succession, we also added support for Zoom VDI, which is also now natively integrated into our firmware. And the long-standing Cisco Jabber is also continued to be supported, and we've kept pace with that with the release cycles. And kind of in sync with that, we've covered a lot of content in and around this area over the past year, both through the CUGC and with Citrix directly. And there's a number of videos on the Tenzig YouTube site that you can get access to hopefully deep dive a little bit more if some of these topics interest you. So there's been some really good improvements to Teams optimization, which are worthy to note, getting tongue-tied there. So starting out firstly with Citrix Workspace app 2101, it's now packaged with Microsoft Teams ringtones, and also significantly where users are plugging in headsets, they are now transposed seamlessly to the Teams application. So if a user arrives and plugs in, let's say, a USB headset, that becomes the default device. Secondly, with Citrix Workspace app 2103 for Linux, and that's integrated into our current firmware, the VP9 video codec is now disabled by default in favor of H.264. And just to cover a little bit more on this, VP9 was traditionally the default video codec for Teams peer-to-peer calls, whereas H.264 was used in conjunction with Teams meeting calls. VP9 generally offers greater bandwidth savings, but at the expense of quite significant encoding overhead, and H.264 benefits from lower powered endpoints. And the general scheme has been that it's offered a greater combined experience. And then last but not least is Citrix Workspace app 2104 for Linux, which again is available in Tenzig firmware, and that offers further improvements, including fixes for choppy audio in certain use cases, as well as echo cancellation, which is disabled by default. And that's really through use of users generally using things like inbuilt speakers and soundbars, etc. So the general recommendation from Citrix at this point in time is to use USB headsets. Moving on to a really significant feature, probably the biggest one of all in honesty, is the gallery view. So just to explain this one for anybody who's not aware, in early versions of the Teams leveraging the optimize mode, where a user participated in a meeting with multiple video participants, one major limitation was that the user operating in optimize mode could only ever see a single video stream simultaneously. So just to put that into perspective on this slide, let's say that I have a meeting. These are the 4 participants in that meeting. In an optimized mode, I would only ever see one speaker in the window, and the other 3 users would be in the bottom bar here, and their video would be muted. How it worked was it worked based on the most dominant speaker in the party, which was great if everybody took their turn to talk. But invariably, what happens especially in a remote working scenario, you get dogs barking, you get the kids homeschooling or coming home from school. So it could make for quite a confusing user experience. So that has now changed with the fact that users of Teams in optimized mode can benefit from the gallery mode at last. It is currently 2x2. Yes, Cole.
We have a quick question here from Matthew Ash. How do you support Teams in a non-persistent VDI environment?
So in a non-persistent environment, there is some articles which I'll link to at the end, which really talk through different scenarios of how to deploy Teams in both a persistent and a non-persistent environment. So there are use cases for both, and again, I'll link to those at the end of the webinar.
Okay, thank you.
Question, thanks. So for the gallery mode specifically, it is limited to just 2x2 at the moment, but it's basically a tap that Microsoft and Citrix expect to turn as they gather feedback. And that does require a specific version of the Teams desktop app, as you can see slated on the slide here. So it's that as a minimum version. And it is important to mention that for things like the gallery view, and Tenzig have always recommended pretty much anything in our mid-range or higher to leverage the video calls, particularly the meeting, with the fact that it can become quite busy. So that would be something like the 6048QC for Linux, or 6010Q for Windows, or in the past generations, something like the 5800Q series. So that's that. Also significantly, and this literally came across this by accident, and I haven't really been able to find a real source of this yet. So this is really even more exciting to share. 2 new preview mode features that are available in Teams with Citrix in an optimized mode. So firstly, large gallery view is also now available within Teams, and this extends further past the 2x2 mode, as you can see from this specific example that we captured yesterday. And then also the familiar together mode. So again, if you prefer the together mode, which puts you into like an auditorium or a meeting room where everybody's in the same room, that is also now featured. So again, a little bit like the feature before, it is specific to a Teams desktop app. Now, again, I haven't been able to confirm as yet the specific version number where it came, but this is the version that we lifted the VDA to yesterday, and we're able to leverage both of these features in preview mode. So again, really, these features alone are the biggest things, probably the biggest kind of roadblocks that hit the Teams optimization in the early days, where really the user experience was somewhat different with using Teams in an optimized mode versus regular Teams desktop app. So yeah, really good features there. We've also added something additional to our firmware in the latest release as well, and that's in relation to the performance estimator for Microsoft Teams. So the performance estimator is there to negotiate with the client hardware to set the webcam encoding size for Teams based on the performance of the endpoint. Now, the early versions, going back to say the 2006 release, were very aggressive in pretty much demarking everything as low powered, and they would force the webcam to 360p. So not only has that performance estimator improved, and it queries pretty much all of our hardware specifically to the point, but you can also now override that as well. So that works hand in hand. You can either increase the encoding size if you've plentiful bandwidth and you've got adequate hardware to support it, but you can also reduce it if you have a user, let's say, in a really remote location with very sort of poor bandwidth, etc. So that can be done, as you can see from this drop down. Now, just to explain quickly, disabled is the default, and that basically means that the performance estimator is on, and it will negotiate with hardware. But you can then override that dependent on your requirements. And one final thing to point out is 1080p is currently not supported by Microsoft, I believe. So 720p is the current maximum. And if you set it to 1080p, it'll fall back to 720p, by the way.
All right, Kevin.
So then, yeah.
Have another question before you get to the WebEx, because there's already been a WebEx question. So after you talk on WebEx, I'll give you the WebEx question. So
Yeah.
user asked, this is Chris Thomas, was that mention of large gallery and together mode available in the HDX optimized version or the web version?
It's a good question. It's the HDX optimized version, so it's in the Teams desktop app, and not. We haven't focused anything on the web app side of Teams.
Then he says, what version of the app in the VDA in the OS is required to, I guess, to get the large gallery and together mode?
That side is independent. On our side, I believe we are using the LTSR version of Citrix, and it was basically delivered through the Teams desktop app, that version that's slated here. And that's a significant point to mention, that these features that have come, both in terms of the gallery and these two preview mode features, they're independent of the Citrix Workspace app and also the VDA. They're actually delivered through updates to the Teams desktop app, with the fact that it's based on the underlying WebRTC stack.
Okay, and another Teams question, does blur background now work with Team in VDA or Teams?
Currently, it's still not, currently blurred background, unfortunately, is still not supported. That, again, I link to an article at the end that Citrix pretty much update every day, that lists any current limitations. And as far as I'm aware, that's more a Microsoft SDK limitation than necessarily a Citrix limitation. But again, that's linked to that at the end of the presentation. Okay. Certainly would encourage users to go to that, and I'm pretty sure that specific point is called out for anybody interested in that feature to talk directly to Microsoft.
Okay, so anything they're wanting to know about configuring the Teams gallery, they can get the links at the end of the presentation and do their research. Okay, all right.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, with the gallery view, there's a blog here that I've linked to. So we'll be linking this slide deck as a PDF at the end. So there's a blog here that specifically talks about that. But like as mentioned, it is essentially delivered through a Teams desktop app update. You don't need to do any additional configuration. It's essentially unlocked by using that as a minimum version in the Teams desktop app. The only thing from our side to be aware of, again, is that you're doing this on a minimum of the 58 or the 6000 series of Tenzig hardware.
All right, for people that have a VMware infrastructure environment, do they need to have, or do you recommend, or I guess does Tenzig recommend that they have like GPU cards in the host in order to help with this, the Teams and WebEx and stuff like that?
It's generally not recommended. If they haven't got GPUs in the back end, then it is recommended, again, on one of those articles that I'll link to it at the end, to turn off hardware acceleration within Teams. But the main bulk of the I guess the process overhead for Teams is in the video encoding, and again, that part gets shifted off to the physical endpoint. So yeah, if you're not using it with vGPU, it is recommended to turn off the hardware acceleration for the native Teams desktop app. But again, a lot of it is relinquished anyway by offloading that to the endpoint and moving it away from the VMs.
All right, that's all the Teams questions.
Awesome, thanks. So let's press on and get over back to Cisco Webex, and again, more exciting hot news. So we've just recently released support for Cisco Webex as well, and again, this is due entirely to feedback and demand from our existing customers who again leverage Cisco Webex either during or before the pandemic, and all of a sudden want to deliver it through Citrix. It's just worth pointing out, because I don't think Cisco Webex is quite as well known as Microsoft Teams, that the Cisco Webex comes in two different flavors. It comes as Cisco Webex App, which recently changed its title from Cisco Webex Teams, again, not to be confused with Microsoft Teams. And it also comes as Cisco Webex Meetings or Cisco Webex Meetings desktop app. So both of those features are supported by the VDI plugin, and our customers can get access to that again through the same firmware that's linked here, both in terms of signing up to our firmware notifications as well as downloading the relevant firmware to support that. And the demonstration, I can't remember if I covered it on the intro slide, but I'll be giving a demo of both the features we just talked about for Microsoft Teams, as well as demonstrating the Cisco Webex VDI support. So this demonstrates the Webex VDI architecture now, and it should sort of resemble the same thing that you saw in the earlier slide around the SDK framework, where the endpoint, i.e. the Tenzig client in this case, is equipped with the Citrix Workspace app for Linux. It also has the 2 plugins embedded into the firmware, and then the Webex app or Webex Meetings app is installed in the Citrix VDA. Now, again, I'll cover this during the demonstration, but that's referred to as installing that into HVD mode, which is Cisco's term for hosted virtual desktop. So that part essentially enables both apps for VDI mode. And what happens from that point is the Webex and the Webex Meetings app communicate with the Citrix VDA or the virtual delivery agent. And that in turn, as we saw with the SDK framework, communicates with all of the call control channel through the Hdx protocol here. And again, like we saw in the SDK framework, the things like the signaling, authentication, controlling, and sharing in yellow here remain with the Webex app and the Webex Meetings app. The Webex sharing traffic, so if a user does a screen share, that is also done at the VDA. So it's the VDA that encodes that screen and shares that to Webex Cloud. The plugins that sit on the endpoint, i.e. the Tenzig client, that encapsulates audio and video traffic. So they traverse directly from the endpoint to Cisco Webex Cloud. So again, hopefully that puts into perspective the architecture there for Webex. So now we're going to switch to a demo.
Do you have time for the one Webex question?
Yeah, sure, Cole. Go ahead.
Okay. This is from Wilmer. I'm going to butcher your name. Sorry, Heredia. How can we do Webex cameras if we have all VDI on data center and the 10 zigs on the facilities? Currently, video quality is low.
So if you'd have been, we've only just introduced this feature. So historically, if you'd have used webcams with Cisco Webex, it would have forwarded the webcam through the traditional Hdx webcam compression technique, that the slide that we covered before, where if you work in the kind of fallback mode where the webcam is forwarded in a compressed state between the endpoint and Cisco Webex, it would have worked in that scenario. So in the VDI mode, which is where the plugin encodes directly at the webcam, that's what you would deliver to deliver that improved visual quality of the webcams, as we'll see in the demo.
Good.
Any more questions so far on Webex?
That's it.
Okay, so let's go for the demo. Let's fingers crossed things work as they did this morning. I've got a recording to fall back to, worst case, but let's go for it. So this is the Tenzig Manager console, where I'm going to shadow specifically a 5848 QDC. And just to quickly recap, this particular model has been with us for probably the best part of 4, maybe 5 years. And again, it's just to prove the concept that the thin clients, even this is a mid-range that's been in the portfolio for 4 to 5 years, can easily deliver these new techniques and these new plugins, even to the highest standard today, which again is 720p on the webcams. So I've already got a shadow session connected to that particular unit, and I've also, or haven't got it yet, but I'm going to SSH to this client so that we can look at basically what's happening under the hood, both with Teams and Webex. So from the endpoint, I'm just going to put in the password just to show you a couple of relevant bits. So under security settings, I've set a password for the endpoint, and I've also enabled the option here to turn on the SSH client. So this is useful for debug, and also if you're doing a POC to actually monitor the endpoint. This is more relevant today based on the fact that a lot of these HDX techniques actually offload overhead to the endpoints. So if we go ahead and we connect to the endpoint here via SSH, so signing in with root and then the password that we set in the control panel there. And if we go ahead and connect, from there I can start top, which is a performance monitor for Linux, and we can see at the moment that the client's pretty much idle. So if you look at the CPU here, it's sat at around 1.5%, and that's mostly taken up through the VNC process here. So that's exactly what we'd expect at this point. Now, also, just to cover, if we go to Citrix Workspace and we go firstly to Teams optimization, that's the options that I mentioned before. So the override performance, remember it's disabled by default, which means the performance estimator's on, and you can override that using any one of those options. If we also go to Cisco Webex, that's where we can turn the Webex VDI on, and that will enable the plugin for both the Webex app and the Webex Meetings app. Just note that it is off by default, so you do have to turn it on, as well as observing the Cisco EULA, which is linked below. So click OK to that, and apart from that, the client's connected in the usual way to point, in this case, to Citrix Storefront, but we could connect to self-service, etc. if we're connecting to Citrix Cloud. So I'm just going to go ahead and attempt to log in. So we do have some non-persistent VMs here, but I'm going to connect for this demo to my personal VM, which is persistent, just so, because I have obviously much more free reign on this particular VM. So the first thing that we just want to cover is Teams. Let's just give it a moment for all the processes to start. And as you can see, Teams is already running. Now, the first thing I want to do, which is already there, but I want to show you anyway, because this is always important for anybody that's doing Citrix and Teams together and the rolling out the optimized mode. Now, to verify that it's operating in the optimized mode, if you go to About and Version, which as mentioned is already displayed here, we can see two significant things: the version of the Teams desktop app, and again, that coincides with the version number that we touched on before that offers the preview mode of the large gallery and the together mode. And we can also see the fact that it's operating in the HDX optimized mode. So that basically means that if we go to settings and we go to devices, all of our audio devices and our webcams are enumerated locally from the endpoint. So this webcam is actually connected to the endpoint, which is there in my vacant empty office. Let's go ahead and let's just start a dummy meeting. Click join now. And you might not be able to see it, but I can already see that that webcam is encoded at a good resolution, 720p. Now, to prove that, we can, on this specific demo, I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring again the SSH session back into view. Now you can see now that the endpoint is sat at around 45%, and that's made up of both the HDX RTC engine, so that's the media engine that's encoding the video, as well as the VNC process. So again, if we weren't shadowing the client, that would reduce. Now bear in mind, these are specified in cores, so this could, because it's a quad core, so if I press number 1 here, you see we have 4 cores. So that could, in theory, go up to 400% before we're effective maximum. So you can see there's plenty of headroom there. And again, this is on effectively an old generation of hardware. Now, again, if I quit out of here, and the next place that we want to go to is tmp/webrpc, and then in there we have a number of different folders. So Teams generates a new folder for every instance where the desktop app is opened, or similarly if we connect to a Citrix session. So if I go to here and we identify the current session, which is that based on the time, the file, the actual log file is then called webrpc.log. So from here, I can do one of few things. I can cat that particular file and I can grep it based on the fact that I know the syntax to some degree in terms of what is output in there. So rather than trawl through the whole log file, I want to query based on performance. And we can see there that the WebRTC engine is detected the endpoint and it's detected that it's medium, which basically means it can encode up to 720p. And if I repeat that again and do it based on height, which I know captures the webcam height, we can see here, look, that the webcam is encoded at 1280 by 720p and it's 30 frames per second. Now, like with any Teams application, you'll see it sort of shift up and shift down as Teams tries to work out the environment specifics, like what bandwidth is available, etc. But the capabilities of hardware permit 720p. So that's just, again, good to show that. And let's just bring top back into view again. So again, we can see the fact that the processor overhead or processor is around about 50%. And then if we come back to the virtual machine, and bearing in mind, based on the earlier question, this isn't a GPU enabled VM. This is, as we'll see, I think it's 4 vCPUs. So 4 vCPUs, and if we look at the performance, you can see it's sat at around 9% at the moment. And again, if we focus in specifically on that, we can see that Teams certainly isn't significant in its overhead because of the fact that the endpoint's doing the work. There's things like the regular desktop Windows manager and also the Citrix graphic engine, which is responsible for encoding this part of the screen. So they're the bits that are generally consuming the overhead on the virtual machine at this point in time.
Hey, Kevin.
So that concludes, yep.
Quick question. For those of us who can barely spell Linux, does Tenzig have like a support article or something that explains like that top and the grep and how to find the log files and all the stuff you just covered in your demo?
We do, yeah. We have an optimization guide specifically for Citrix and Teams, and again, I'll share that at the end. Okay. We also have a support team that's based in Phoenix, Arizona, that can assist with this. Honestly, it's not necessary that end users necessarily even have to dig into these log files. I do this purely out of, I think, feedback based from the community, that people like to see these sorts of things to see what's happening under the hood. But certainly end users are not really expected to go this deep. And that's really one of the beauties of the Tenzig Linux, the fact that most users don't even know that it's running Linux. You know, there's a graphical front end, and it's our job really to manage the back end. So it's only really for the, I guess, the Linux fanboys out there for this part.
So an admin engineer could use the same commands also for Citrix and Webex.
Yes.
Okay.
But let me just clarify that. So to do the same debug, did you mean with Webex as well?
Yes.
So yeah, the answer is yes, and I'll do that in the next demo when we move across to Webex.
Okay.
So is there any more questions, Carl?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, so let's go ahead and open Webex. But actually, I forgot one thing. Again, I covered it on the slide, and it'll be back there at the end. But I created a README for this because, again, it was pretty confusing to me. So I'm not sure if it will be to you guys as well. But there's 2 MSIs dependent on whether you're using Webex App, again, which is formerly Webex Teams, or Webex Meetings. Now, the MSI for Webex App is called webex.msi, which is easy enough. But then, if you're using Webex Meetings, the MSI is called Webex App. So just be aware of that, not to get the two things confused. And again, there's the last slide recaps on that, which again everybody will have access to. Now, when you're installing the Webex app or the Webex or Webex Meetings Webex app, the bit that enables the HVD are the switches here. So all users equals 1 allows or installs it against all user profiles. Enable VDI equals 1, again specifically enables the HVD functionality, and you also have to disable the auto upgrade enabled. And that, going back again to the Teams example in a non-persistent environment, that's covered in the Teams guide, that it's recommended that you deploy Teams and you disable the auto upgrade to again assist with the fact that using it in a non-persistent environment. So I have already installed Webex, and it is honestly as simple as that. You run the MSI, you click next once, you don't even have to go and make a cup of tea or coffee, the job's done. So we sign into Webex, and very similar to Teams, the way in which firstly we verify that it's operating in VDI mode is we can go to help and we can go to the health checker, and the health checker you can see gives us the VDI functionality. So if the VDI isn't ticked, it's normally that you haven't installed it with that VDI switch, as well as that tick box are demonstrated in the Tenzig client to actually enable the plugin. But this gives us a summary of the Webex client and the plugin version, as well as the round trip time between the endpoint and the Cisco Webex cloud services.
Okay,
now,
we have a question on the two MSIs. Mohammed want to know Webex.MSI is on the VDI and WebApp.MSI is on the endpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. So both of these are both on the VDI. So they're both on the Citrix VDA, and it's just whether you as a Cisco customer are running either Webex app or Webex meetings. So they're both installed on the VDA. As far as the actual plugins concerned, the bit that goes on the endpoint, that is already baked into firmware. So the users don't need to do anything with that. It's already baked into the firmware, and all they need to do is either upgrade to that firmware, which again is covered back on that slide, and then enable that tick box, the Cisco Webex VDI.
All right, quick, does Tenzig support soft phone clients like Avaya?
Avaya is covered at the end. We don't currently support Avaya for Linux. It is covered for Windows-based clients, and in a Linux environment, you could, in theory, use it with the Hdx real-time compression, where again the audio would be forwarded from the endpoint to the VDI. We're really waiting for more input and demand for Avaya. We've heard it in a couple of different pockets over the past year, but certainly not to the extent of things like Cisco and Zoom and Teams before it.
All right, and then also on Webex, if the Webex Meetings is already installed on all our VDI computers, how can we enable VDI mode?
That's a good question. I don't believe there's a way to modify it. I would have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure that it's a case of having to uninstall and reinstall with the with that VDI switch that I demonstrated before.
Okay, and this one I'm not really understanding the question, mainly because I guess I don't use Web. He wants for the MSIs, we have to use the switches on both sides to enable VDI mode.
So I think that question again is dependent on whether you do the switches on both the endpoint and the VDA. So just to clarify, if that is the question, just to clarify again that both of these examples are both done inside the VDA. It's not, you don't have to do this on the endpoint at all. If you're using a Tenzig Linux client, the plugin is already pre-installed, and it's just a case of enabling the plugin. These switches are purely in the case of, firstly, this one is if you're using Cisco Webex app, and use this one if you're using Cisco Webex meetings. So they're two different products, of Cisco. You've got Cisco Webex and you've got Cisco Webex Meetings, and they're both different licenses, etc.
Okay, and then at the end, you're going to have a link for the optimization guides for stuff. Okay.
Correct. Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Because
There's
we're
a
getting
slide at the end of-
optimization questions, and I figure
Yeah,
we can just wait till the end, and they can see
yeah.
the links and down and read the
That's
articles.
it.
And
Yeah. Hopefully all the links are there that people need, both for Microsoft Teams and Cisco Webex.
Okay.
Good to proceed.
Yes, go.
Thank you. Okay, so next thing, similar as we did with Microsoft Teams, if we go to settings and we go to video and audio, we should be able to see exactly the same sort of thing, that the plugin on the endpoint, which again is pre-baked, is enumerating those towards the Cisco Webex app that sits on the virtual desktop. So we see the same devices that we saw with Microsoft Teams. And if I go in here, and as we did with Microsoft Teams, we set up a dummy meeting, and I'm specifically just going to leave it there because when I click Start Meeting, my webcam preview will actually reduce in size, and it's nice to have it bigger with the fact that it creates a bit more load. So again, similar sort of thing. If I go to Task Manager on the virtual machine here, on the virtual desktop, you can see that the processor is pretty low in terms of its consumption. Again, it's really just the desktop window manager and the Citrix graphics engine that's creating the consumption, and that's really because of the task manager that's moving around and creating that encoding overhead to the Windows desktop. But if we were to look towards details and look, for example, at any of the Cisco services, again, the same sort of thing with Microsoft Teams. It's really doing nothing because the bulk of the work is done on the endpoint. So if, again, like we did with Microsoft Teams, we now turn the attention towards the endpoint through the SSH session, the Webex VDI process is sat at around 45%. Now that is less than we saw in Microsoft Teams. It's around about 20% at the moment, but in fairness, with Microsoft Teams, we had it in a very much a full screen affair. But again, that should demonstrate the fact that the video or the webcam is offloaded entirely to the endpoint. And again, just to recap on those same equivalent log files for Cisco, and again, just to clarify, a user wouldn't necessarily need to go here. I'm just showing you out of pure curiosity as to what happens under the hood. So we go to cd/var/log, and then in there we have a number of different log files, but the one that we're specifically interested in is Cisco Webex VDI, and then it's really the current log that I'm interested in, and I don't know this one quite as well in terms of the syntax, so let me just quickly check what it was. So it's stream up firstly, and that's used, should be capital U, and that's used to verify whether the virtual channel, i.e. the link between the endpoint and the virtual desktop, is up, which you can see it is. Now these log files are far more verbose by default than the Teams equivalent ones. So again, if I grep on, let's say, the particular webcam, you can see the amount of activity that the log files generated in terms of communicating with the webcam on the endpoint. So again, I think it's really important just to confirm that an end user wouldn't necessarily go in here at all. These are for support, if not developers, but this is just to show really what's happening under the hood based on previous feedback of people liking to go technical on this stuff.
Yeah,
so
some programmer has a good sense of humor. Friendly name is ugly. Try to get a better name.
Good spot. I'm just going to roll forward just because I'm conscious we're kind of running a little bit short on time, but this recaps all the different unified communication apps in terms of their current supported state. And this is specifically for Tenzig endpoints. So here we see Tenzig Windows 10 IoT, and here we see Tenzig Linux, specifically it's our NOS image, which supports Citrix. So you can see we've got a yes across the board, with the exception, as we mentioned before, with Avaya 1X. So currently that isn't supported by Linux. The other thing to mention is the web app optimization. So that's if you're using, and again, the question came up earlier, if you're using either the Teams web app or the Cisco Webex web app, i.e. running those inside a browser on the virtual desktop, you can leverage Citrix browser content redirection, but at the moment, it's only supported by the Windows endpoints, the Windows CWA. There's some work happening with BCR in Linux, so maybe in the not too distant future, that situation might change, but as of now, it's firmly on the Windows CWA. And I think that brings us to poll question 3, and then should bring us to the end of the webinar. Stephanie, please.
Okay, and I just wanted to double check. This one is about which application? Because I have 4 questions.
Yeah.
Or do we go to the? Okay, just double check.
Yeah, that's right. It's the which UC platform are you using? So again, it's just for us to understand what's being used out there, really. Let's hope everybody hasn't ticked to buy a 1X. Okay, so that's good, and that's honestly kind of where we pitched it. Again, I think for the other, if you've got specific interest, feel free to ask a question at the end, and we can take that away. And yeah, but for the most part, it looks like we're well covered there. Okay, so we are really running a little bit short of time, but I did, as mentioned multiple times, throw up a different slide for Teams optimization, really a recap and summary plus pointers towards firstly Microsoft Teams with various things we've discussed. So move that back. So you've got the ability of overriding the performance estimator on Citrix Workspace app for Windows. This particular registry key, which again is covered in this Citrix article, which I'll come back to in a moment, is really useful for verifying state of team optimization and also even disabling it as well, again, for debug. And the processes that you want to be monitoring. So on the VDA, it's CTX GFX, which is the encoding overhead of Citrix, and then Teams, obviously the native Teams app. And then these are the processes on the endpoint. So WFICA is Citrix Workspace app, and then HDX Teams or HDX RTC engine are the processes that sit on the endpoint. And then those logging locations I mentioned are covered here. Now, the links here, these are really, really important. Now, and I have to refer to these pretty much every day, in all honesty. These two here are updated probably daily, if not weekly, and worst case monthly by Citrix, because Teams is obviously a forever changing kind of environment where, as you saw through some of the examples, the desktop app is moving at a frequent rate. So that should really be your go-to if you're deploying Teams with Citrix in an optimized mode. That those two things right there should be your go-to in terms of how to configure, how to troubleshoot, and again, any specific known limitations. And again, it's important to emphasize with the known limitations that they're not necessarily specific to the endpoint or even Citrix. Sometimes they are specific to the SDK that Microsoft provide, and they are covered both in this particular link here and this Microsoft link here, which covers Teams for VDI, because that same SDK is offered out to other vendors as well. So that's a good place to check to see if there is a limitation, like we talked about the blurred background before or earlier, to understand if it is a limitation, where is it a limitation, and who do we have to talk to hopefully address that in future versions. And then lastly, on the Cisco Webex side, we've got the equivalent thing. So here's a compatibility guide for understanding different version understandings as far as backwards compatibility. And then also the MSIs. Now, this was a really good point, obviously many people have mentioned, but again, these MSIs, they're specific to the virtual desktop, nothing to do with the endpoint. And the same thing for the switches as well. They have to be enabled to enable the VDI functionality, but they're all done inside the VDA. You've also got the equivalent processes there. both that sit on the Citrix VDA and the endpoint, as well as that endpoint login location that I referred to. And then finally, the deployment guide for Cisco Webex. So that is covered, but Cisco is a little bit different in terms of their content isn't probably as publicly available. You obviously have to have an agreement with Cisco, and I would sort of urge that any Cisco customers out there make contact with Cisco to get the latest and greatest guides from their teams, and if necessary, we can assist with that as well. But they should be responsible for providing you with the deployment guide specific to the version that you're deploying. So that brings us to the end. I'm sorry we're 2 minutes late. There's just one final poll question, and then hopefully if we've covered the questions, that's it, but I'll gladly take any other questions that may have come in since, Carl.
No additional questions. So someone asked, how does Tenzig compare to Igel? And I've been posting them links that I found on the Igel site, you know, for Tenzig success stories. So
yeah, that's great. I mean, it's a question we get asked a lot. You know, we pretty much in every POC we go head to head. You know, I'd like to think that we're a bit more nimble. We take an approach of making things easier out of the box. So, you know, we're all about less clicks to get to a point where you can connect to Citrix, and we have an approach that we like to be like a zero client. We're not a true zero client in the fact that we have a proprietary chip, but we're certainly a much more lean distribution that supports just Citrix, and it's set up in I guess a kiosk style or a zero client style mode where you're not having to turn off things like taskbars and desktop window managers to get you to a point you just want to log into Citrix. And I think the other equivalent thing or thing worthy to mention is that there aren't the same sort of licensing constraints with Tenzig as far as things like the management tool, any support subscriptions. But check us both out. You know, some people have preference. It's like anything. You know, people have preference to one or the other. And you know, like I say, we go head to head with them all the time. So it's best for each user to check out what suits.
So when I buy a Tenzig device, I get the software, I get the management, I get support. I don't have to buy extra licenses.
I don't like answering this question because it's making our sales guys' life easy. But yeah, the simple answer is it is bundled. You know, you buy one Tenzig client or you buy several thousand. The management is inclusive. The firmware is inclusive for effectively the warranty or the lifetime of the product, which by default is 3 years. So yeah, everything is bundled in, no hidden costs.
All right, there's a lot more questions questions are popping in, but most of these Stephanie can send you those offline and you can answer those offline. Else we'll probably be here for another 20 minutes answering questions.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's good, always good to get questions. So yeah, feel free to send those over, Stephanie and Carl, and I can either answer them directly or I can distribute them to my co-workers in each location. So that's great. So I'm sorry again, we've run over a little bit, but I think we got everything I wanted to cover and more. So thank you.
Yeah, do you want to, and we have a few people still here. Do you want to run the one last question that we had?
Oh, yes, please, yeah.
I'll throw that out there.
How did I forget that one?
I know it's about getting stuff.
So yeah, if everybody could just answer, please, the final question.
Oh, I just put the link to get a demo in the chat window.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know this was your last poll question.
I'll give you guys a couple more seconds, and then we'll close things out because I do have one last slide because I know some of you probably want to know about the giveaway. Let's see. Looks like most of you have voted, so I'll go ahead and close that, and then I will share my one last slide. Can you see it? Yes, there it is. All right, always makes me happy when GoToWebinar agrees and does what it's supposed to do. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for today's presentation. It was a lot of good discussion, lots of good questions. I know some of you might have opted in for a chance to win an Amazon gift card, and those of you who've been on a webinar with us before where there's a prize probably know that I like to be fair. So what I do is I pull the attendance report after the webinar is done, because some of you guys register after we're already underway. So I want to give everyone a fair shot. I'll pull the report. We'll use a random number generator to pick a winner, and I will email you. So look out for an email from me, but you can also keep an eye on our Twitter account to find out who won the prize. And with that,
Oh
just
man, I
want to
thought the
thank you.
moderator got the $150 Amazon gift card. Oh,
I mean, what about the host?
Or the presenter.
I mean, we work hard.
that's right. That's right.
Thank you guys. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Carl. Thanks for being
Thanks,
here
Stephanie.
today.
Thanks, Carl. Great session.
Yeah.
Everyone have a great afternoon. Be on the lookout for the recording link, and I'm pretty sure I have a PDF of the slide deck to share, and we'll get that out. So be on the lookout for that tomorrow. All right, everyone have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.